What archaeologists are now calling the discovery that fundamentally altered our understanding of Spanish colonial expeditions in North America began beneath a crumbling stone wall on a neglected farm in rural New Mexico, all set in motion by one woman's determination to honor her family legacy while saving her struggling homestead. A chance discovery that would eventually bring military officials to her property, trigger classified meetings at the Pentagon, and ultimately rewrite significant portions of history about lost treasures and secret expeditions across the American Southwest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient tractor sputtered reluctantly as Gabriela Mendoza guided it across the overgrown field, tall weeds bending beneath the rusted plow attachment. At 29, the environmental science graduate had never imagined herself battling stubborn soil and temperamental farm equipment. Yet here she was, squinting against the harsh New Mexican sun as she attempted to reclaim land that had been neglected for nearly a decade. "Come on, you stubborn beast," she muttered, adjusting her worn baseball cap as the tractor coughed threateningly before resuming its labored progress. This particular section of the property, a remote corner by weathered stone walls that her great-uncle Emilio had always left untouched, was proving especially difficult to clear. 3 months ago, Gabriela had been working at an environmental consulting firm in Albuquerque, her degree finally paying off with a steady job and promising career path. Then came the call about Uncle Emilio's passing, followed by the shocking news that he had left his entire 175-acre farm to her, the only family member who had shown genuine interest in his stories about the land's history and significance. "It's cursed land, Mia," he would tell her during childhood summers spent on the farm. "The old Spanish explorers passed through here looking for gold. Some say they found it, some say it destroyed them. Either way, that back section stays wild. Some things are better left buried." As a child, she had believed his warnings held mystical significance. As an adult with mounting debt from student loans and a property now facing bank foreclosure due to years of unpaid taxes, Gabriela viewed his superstitions differently. Every acre needed to be productive if she had any chance of saving the farm. The inheritance had seemed like a blessing at first, a piece of family heritage and a connection to the land her ancestors had worked for generations. That romantic notion had quickly collided with harsh reality. The farmhouse was barely habitable, the equipment decades past its prime, and the back taxes substantial enough to make her environmental science salary seem laughably inadequate. Her friends had universally advised selling to developers eager to subdivide the property into vacation homes. "You're not a farmer, Gabby," her best friend Elena had insisted during their last phone call. "This is financial suicide. Sell the land, pay off your student loans, and put a down payment on a condo in Albuquerque." The advice was undeniably practical. Yet something about the weathered farmhouse with its view of distant mesas, the way morning light spilled across fields her family had tended for generations, made the decision impossible. There was history here, her history. And so, Gabriela had taken a leave of absence from her job, withdrawn her modest savings, and thrown herself into an intensive crash course on small-scale organic farming, determined to make the land productive. Again, the tractor suddenly lurched as the plow struck something solid, the impact nearly throwing Gabriela from her seat. Cutting the engine, she climbed down to investigate, expecting another of the countless rocks that seemed to multiply across the fields overnight. What she found instead was a section of the old stone wall that had partially collapsed, revealing what appeared to be a small opening behind it. The stones here were different, more carefully placed than the rough boundary walls, with clear signs of deliberate construction. "What in the world?" she murmured, kneeling to examine the opening. Uncle Emilio had never mentioned any structures in this section of the property. Grabbing a flashlight from the tractor's toolbox, She peered into the darkness, the beam revealing what appeared to be a small manufactured space, perhaps 3 feet wide and extending back into darkness. Years of scientific training had taught Gabriella to approach the unexpected with methodical curiosity rather than impulsive action. But this discovery on her own property stirred something more primal, a connection to the mysteries her great-uncle had hinted at throughout her childhood. After ensuring the surrounding wall wouldn't collapse further, she carefully removed additional loose stones, widening the opening enough to reach inside. The space appeared to be a deliberately constructed niche or small chamber built into the thickest section of the wall. As her flashlight beam probed deeper, it reflected off something metallic near the back of the cavity. With careful movements, Gabriella reached in, her fingers connecting with what felt like a small metal box or container. It was surprisingly heavy as she worked it free from its hiding place, its surface covered with decades, perhaps centuries, of accumulated grime. In the bright New Mexico sunlight, she could see it was a metal case approximately 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, crafted of what appeared to be iron with elaborate decorative elements visible beneath the dirt. The craftsmanship suggested significant age, with hand-forged hinges and what appeared to be ornate but severely tarnished locking mechanism that had long since corroded open. Gabriella's heart raced as she gently worked the ancient hinges, which protested with a low grating sound before finally yielding. Inside, protected from the elements by the sealed container and stone chamber, lay what appeared to be carefully folded parchment, remarkably preserved despite its obvious age. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With the care her scientific training demanded, she gently unfolded the top document, revealing elegant Spanish script in faded brown ink. Though her Spanish was conversational at best, she immediately recognized the document as extremely old. The handwriting, style and formal structure unlike anything from modern times. The date at the top, however, she could read clearly, 15D. Mayo, 1541. 1541? She whispered in disbelief. That would place the document during the Coronado expedition, one of the earliest Spanish explorations of what would later become the American Southwest. Gabriella carefully refolded the parchment and returned it to the box, suddenly aware that she might be handling something of genuine historical significance. Her undergraduate minor in Southwestern history provided just enough knowledge to recognize that documents from this period were extraordinarily rare. Most had been lost to time, war, or the harsh desert environment. Back at the farmhouse with the metal case carefully placed on the kitchen table, Gabriella cleaned decades of grime from its surface using techniques she recalled from a museum conservation workshop during college. As layers of dirt were gently removed, intricate engravings emerged, decorative borders surrounding what appeared to be the emblem of the Spanish crown. Inside, the box contained not one but 7 separate documents, all on the same type of parchment, along with what appeared to be a carefully drawn map on a larger piece. The map showed recognizable geographical features, mountain ranges and rivers that corresponded to the region, along with markings and notations in the same elegant script. With growing excitement, Gabriella carefully photographed each document with her phone before attempting any further handling. Though her Spanish was limited, certain words in the text jumped out at her: oro, gold; tesoro, treasure, and repeated references to La Ciudad Escondida, the hidden city. The map contained additional markings, what appeared to be directional indicators, distance measurements, and several locations marked with distinctive symbols. Most notably, a location approximately 50 miles southwest of her farm was marked with an elaborate cross and star pattern, accompanied by text too faded to decipher completely. As darkness fell across the farm, Gabriella sat at her kitchen table surrounded by her great-uncle's outdated laptop, reference books borrowed years ago and never returned, and the photographs of the documents she'd discovered. After hours of research, the significance of her find was becoming increasingly clear. These appeared to be private records from a member of the Coronado expedition, documents that diverged significantly from the official accounts. If authentic, they suggested that Coronado's party had discovered significant gold deposits, or possibly an indigenous settlement with considerable wealth, findings deliberately omitted from official reports to the Spanish crown. The documents hinted at a splinter group that had separated from the main expedition to secure these discoveries for themselves, only to disappear from historical record entirely. Most intriguingly, the map seemed to indicate the location of either the gold source or where these treasures had been concealed, information that would fundamentally alter historical understanding of early Spanish expeditions and their discoveries in North America. Sleep evaded Gabriela that night, her mind racing with the implications of what lay in the metal box. By morning, she had reached a decision. She needed expert assistance to authenticate the documents and understand their full significance. As an environmental scientist, she recognized the limits of her expertise and the importance of proper evaluation for potentially significant historical artifacts. After careful consideration, she contacted Dr. Sofia Hernandez, her former Southwestern history professor at the University of New Mexico, whose specialty was Spanish colonial exploration. Without revealing the full scope of her discovery, Gabriela described finding potentially significant historical documents related to early Spanish expeditions and asked for guidance on authentication and proper handling. Dr. Hernandez's response came within hours' immediate interest and an offer to visit the farm the following day to assess the documents personally. Her message emphasized the importance of proper preservation techniques in the meantime, including specific recommendations for temperature, humidity, and handling that Gabriela implemented immediately, converting her rarely used home office into a makeshift preservation space. While waiting for Dr. Hernandez's visit, Gabriela continued clearing the farm, but found herself repeatedly drawn back to the stone wall where she'd made the discovery. Careful examination revealed that the wall itself was considerably older than the other boundary markers on the property, its construction technique distinctly different, more reminiscent of Spanish colonial methods than the typical ranching structures of the American period. This observation sparked a memory of one of Uncle Emilio's stories, how the land had once been part of a Spanish land grant dating back to the 1700s, remaining in the extended family for generations before eventually passing to his branch in the early 1900s. He had often hinted that the property held secrets from the old days, though Gabriela had always assumed this was just colorful embellishment to entertain a curious child. The arrival of Dr. Hernandez the following afternoon brought a new level of gravity to the situation. The professor, a renowned expert in her field with numerous published works on Spanish colonial history, had arrived prepared with archival quality gloves, specialized lighting equipment, and a digital microscope for preliminary examination. When Gabriela presented the metal case and its contents, laid out carefully on acid-free paper as the professor had instructed over the phone, Dr. Hernandez's professional composure momentarily faltered. "Where exactly did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she carefully examined the metal case without touching it. Gabriela described the stone wall, the hidden chamber, and the circumstances of her discovery. As she spoke, Dr. Hernandez's expression transformed from academic interest to barely contained excitement. "Gabriela," she said finally, donning the archival gloves, "if these are what they appear to be, and I must emphasize that proper authentication will require extensive testing, you may have discovered something truly extraordinary." With painstaking care, the professor examined each document, occasionally photographing details with her specialized equipment or making notes in a small leather-bound journal she carried. After nearly 2 hours of meticulous examination, she looked up at Gabriela with an expression of barely contained wonder. The physical characteristics are consistent with documents from the period, she explained, her voice still measured but unable to fully conceal her excitement. The parchment type, ink composition, script style all align with what we would expect from mid-16th century Spanish expedition records. The metal case itself appears to be of the appropriate period as well, with craftsmanship consistent with Spanish colonial metallurgy. So they could be authentic? Gabriela asked, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. Preliminary assessment suggests a strong possibility, Dr. Hernandez confirmed cautiously. But proper authentication will require specialized tests, material analysis, ink dating, comparative script analysis with known documents from the period. She carefully returned the documents to their case before continuing. What's most remarkable, however, is the content. If authentic, these documents present a perspective on the Coronado expedition that contradicts official accounts in significant ways. They suggest discoveries, substantial gold finds, or settlements with considerable wealth that were deliberately omitted from reports to the Spanish crown. Why would they hide something like that? Gabriela asked. Historical context suggests several possibilities, Dr. Hernandez explained. Official expeditions were required to deliver a specific percentage of all discoveries to the crown. By keeping certain findings secret, participants could potentially claim these resources for themselves. Additionally, some expeditions consisted of rival factions with competing interests and allegiances. The professor paused, choosing her next words carefully. The map is particularly significant. It appears to indicate specific locations that don't appear in any known official records from the period. If authentic, it could potentially lead to archaeological sites or even resources that have remained undiscovered for nearly 5 centuries. As the implications of these words settled over Gabriela, a practical question emerged. What should I do with them? I want to do the right thing historically, but this farm is also my responsibility. Dr. Hernandez nodded thoughtfully. These materials, if authentic, have considerable historical significance and potentially substantial monetary value as well. As the property owner who discovered them, you have certain rights, but there are also ethical and legal considerations regarding historically significant artifacts. She recommended that Gabriela allow her to arrange preliminary authentication tests through university connections while maintaining confidentiality about the exact nature and location of the find. She emphasized that proper authentication would strengthen Gabriela's position regardless of what she ultimately decided to do with the documents. In the meantime, the professor advised, I would recommend discretion. Discoveries of this nature can attract significant attention, not all of it welcome or with historical preservation as the primary motivation. After Dr. Hernandez departed with carefully taken photographs and measurements, but not the original documents, Gabriela found herself alone with the weight of her discovery settling more fully upon her. What had begun as a simple farm clearing project had unexpectedly connected her to a historical mystery centuries in the making. That evening, as Gabriela sat on the farmhouse porch watching the sunset paint the distant mesas with golden light, her phone chimed with an incoming email. Dr. Hernandez had already made preliminary inquiries with colleagues, specializing in Spanish colonial documents and artifacts. The response was promising based solely on the photographs and descriptions. 2 experts had expressed strong interest in conducting formal authentication procedures, noting that the physical characteristics appeared consistent with the claimed period. More significantly, one expert had identified parallels between the handwriting in Gabriela's documents and known samples from a chronicler who had accompanied the Coronado expedition, but whose complete records had been thought lost to history. As Gabriela contemplated these developments, a truck appeared on the long dirt road leading to the farmhouse her neighbor, Miguel Sandoval, whose family had farmed adjacent land for generations. He occasionally checked in on her, offering practical advice and assistance that had proven invaluable during her transition to farm life. "Any luck with that back section?" he called as he approached the porch, declining her offer of lemonade with a friendly wave. "That's always been rough ground. Your uncle never would touch it, you know." "I actually found something interesting," Gabriela replied carefully, recalling Dr. Hernandez's advice about discretion. "Some old stones that might have been part of an earlier structure." Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "Wouldn't surprise me. This whole area was active during the Spanish period. My grandfather used to tell stories about old Spanish travelers who came through looking for something they'd lost. Said they had maps and papers, but never found what they were searching for." The casual comment sent a chill through Gabriela. "When was this?" she asked, trying to keep her tone conversational. "Oh, long before my time," Miguel replied. "Early 1900s, I think. Strange men who spoke Spanish but weren't from around here. Asked a lot of questions about old ruins and landmarks. My grandfather was just a boy then, but he remembered them clearly because they offered gold coins for information." This unexpected connection to her discovery left Gabriela momentarily speechless. Had others been searching for the same location marked on her map a century ago? The possibility suggested that rumors or records of the hidden treasures had persisted long after the original expedition. After Miguel departed, Gabriela returned to the documents, examining the map with renewed interest. The location marked with the distinctive cross and star symbol appeared to be in an area now part of the Carson National Forest, rugged terrain that had remained largely undeveloped even in modern times. Using her laptop's mapping software, she attempted to correlate the ancient map's landmarks with modern geographical features. Despite the centuries of difference, certain mountains, river bends, and distinctive mesa formations remained recognizable, allowing her to make a tentative identification of the marked location. It appeared to be in a remote canyon system approximately 50 miles southwest of her farm, an area she had actually visited during an undergraduate ecology field study. The region was known for its archaeological significance, with numerous indigenous sites dating back centuries, though no major Spanish colonial discoveries had been documented there. The coincidence seemed almost too perfect that she, with her particular background in both environmental science and southwestern history, should be the one to discover documents potentially leading to a historical site in an area she had already studied. It felt as though the farm, the discovery, and her unique combination of knowledge had converged through some greater purpose. As the realization of what she might have discovered continued to unfold, Gabriela was struck by how her perspective on the farm had shifted. What had initially seemed like an overwhelming burden, a property draining her savings and derailing her career, had unexpectedly connected her to a historical legacy far deeper than she had imagined. The land that had been in her family for generations potentially held keys to historical mysteries that had remained unsolved for centuries. The following morning brought unexpected developments. An email arrived from Dr. Hernandez with surprising news. Her preliminary inquiries had apparently triggered interest beyond academic circles. A colleague at the university had been contacted by someone identifying themselves as a historical research consultant for the Department of Defense, expressing interest in examining any recently discovered Spanish colonial documents from the region. "I revealed nothing about your discovery," Dr. Hernandez assured her. "But this unusual inquiry, immediately following my discreet consultations, seems unlikely to be coincidental. The military has historically maintained interest in certain Spanish colonial expeditions, particularly those with detailed mapping of the region, though such interest is rarely acknowledged publicly." The email concluded with gentle advice. "Whatever you decide to do with your discovery, Gabriela, proceed with awareness that its significance may extend beyond purely historical or academic spheres." This cryptic warning left Gabriela unsettled. Why would the Department of Defense have interest in centuries-old Spanish documents? The question lingered as she returned to work on the farm, the physical labor providing welcome distraction from the increasingly complex implications of her find. As she worked to clear another section of overgrown field, Gabriela noticed an unfamiliar black SUV driving slowly past the property, unusual on the rarely traveled rural road. The vehicle continued without stopping, but its tinted windows, government plates sent another wave of unease through her. That afternoon, Dr. Hernandez called rather than emailing, her voice tense with urgency. Gabriela, I've received a formal inquiry from a Major Williams with something called the Historical Artifacts Division of the Pentagon. He specifically asked about Spanish colonial documents discovered in your county within the past week. How could they possibly know? Gabriela asked, alarm rising. Academic networks can be surprisingly efficient at spreading information, even unintentionally, the professor explained. Someone I consulted may have mentioned the inquiry to a colleague with government connections. What concerns me is the speed and specificity of their interest. After a moment's hesitation, Dr. Hernandez continued, there's something else you should know. Certain Spanish expedition documents have been classified as materials of strategic interest by the government since at least the 1940s. The official justification involves potential information about natural resources and geographical features with military significance, but there have always been rumors about other motivations. What kind of motivations? Gabriela asked. Some historians believe certain Spanish expeditions encountered technologies or resources beyond what their reports officially acknowledged. The professor replied carefully. Most serious scholars dismiss such theories, but the government's persistent interest in these materials has occasionally fueled speculation. The conversation left Gabriela with a growing sense that her discovery had implications far beyond what she had initially imagined. What had begun as an intriguing historical find was rapidly developing into something with apparent strategic significance to powerful institutions. That evening, as sunset painted the distant mesas with golden light, Gabriela sat on her porch contemplating her next steps. The farm that had seemed like a burden now felt like protection, a private space where she could consider options away from institutional pressures or oversight. As darkness settled over the land, headlights appeared on the distant road leading to her property. The black SUV she had noticed earlier was returning, this time turning onto her long driveway. Gabriela felt a surge of apprehension as the vehicle approached, stopping in front of her farmhouse. A tall man in civilian clothes, but with an unmistakably military bearing, emerged from the passenger side. Ms. Mendoza? He called, remaining beside the vehicle. Major Daniel Williams, Department of Defense. I was hoping we might speak briefly about a matter of historical interest. The direct approach confirmed her fears. Whatever she had discovered, powerful institutions were already mobilizing to assess or control it. As Gabriela rose to meet this unexpected visitor, she realized that the path forward would require careful navigation between historical truth, institutional interests, and her own rights and responsibilities. The simple act of clearing her great-uncle's neglected land had unexpectedly thrust her into a complex intersection of history, government interest, and family legacy, a situation that would demand every bit of her intelligence, integrity, and determination to resolve appropriately. Standing on the porch of the farmhouse that connected her to generations past, Gabriela prepared to face a future suddenly filled with unexpected possibilities and challenges. Making this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Gabriela's shoulders as she invited Major Williams to join her on the porch, deliberately choosing this outdoor setting rather than allowing him into her home where the documents were secured. The Major's professional demeanor carried an underlying intensity that confirmed the significance of his visit. "I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, Ms. Mendoza," he began, declining her offer of water with a polite shake of his head. "I understand you may have recently discovered historical materials on your property." The directness of the approach was startling. Gabriella had expected at least some pretense or circumlocution, not this immediate acknowledgement of his purpose. She chose her response carefully. "I found various items while clearing the farm," she replied noncommittally. "This property has been in my family for generations. May I ask what specific interest the Department of Defense has in my land?" Williams smiled thinly, recognizing the deliberate vagueness of her answer. "The DoD maintains historical research divisions focused on various periods. Spanish colonial exploration of this region falls under our purview due to early military mapping and resource documentation that impacts modern defense planning." It was a reasonable explanation on the surface, yet something in his delivery suggested layers of unstated purpose. Gabriella had spent enough time conducting environmental impact studies to recognize when someone was providing technical truth, while avoiding complete disclosure. "That's fascinating," she responded. "Though I'm surprised such historical research warrants personal visits to private citizens." The Major's expression remained carefully neutral. "Certain historical materials have significance beyond academic interest, Ms. Mendoza. Documents from the period you're clearing, particularly those related to Spanish expeditions between 1540 and 1542, may contain information relevant to national security considerations." The specific date range precisely encompassing the Coronado expedition confirmed that somehow, despite Dr. Hernandez's discretion, detailed information about her discovery had reached government channels. "If you have found such materials," Williams continued, "the Department of Defense can offer resources for proper authentication, preservation, and study that would be unavailable through other channels. We would, of course, ensure you receive appropriate recognition and compensation." Despite the professional tone and reasonable words, Gabriella sensed the implicit pressure beneath the offer. This wasn't simply a scholarly interest or bureaucratic procedure. Williams had driven to her remote farm personally, after hours, with remarkable speed following her discovery. "I appreciate the offer," she responded carefully, "but any significant historical materials would require proper assessment by independent experts before I make decisions about their disposition. I've already consulted with historical preservation specialists at the university." A flicker of something disappointment, frustration, crossed Williams' face before his professional mask returned. "That's certainly your right. I would, however, caution that materials from this specific period and region have specialized handling requirements and security considerations that even university experts might not fully appreciate." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, which he placed on the small table between them. "When you're ready to discuss this further, you can reach me directly at this number, day or night." As he stood to leave, Williams added what seemed like an afterthought, but felt carefully calculated. "One last thing, Ms. Mendoza. Some historical materials fall under federal jurisdiction, regardless of where they're discovered. The Archaeological Resources Protection Act and related regulations establish clear protocols for certain categories of artifacts." The subtle reminder of potential legal complications hung in the air as he departed, the black SUV disappearing down the long driveway, and leaving Gabriella with a growing sense that her discovery had implications far beyond what she had initially imagined. Once certain the vehicle was truly gone, she returned inside and called Dr. Hernandez, who answered immediately despite the late hour. "A DoD representative was just here," Gabriella explained, the tension evident in her voice. "He knew specific details about the discovery, including the exact date range of the documents." "This is concerning but not entirely surprising," the professor replied. The government has maintained classified interest in certain Spanish colonial materials since at least World War II. The speed of their response suggests your documents may have particular significance within whatever framework they're operating from. He mentioned federal jurisdiction over certain historical materials, Gabriela added. That's a complex legal area, Dr. Hernandez acknowledged. While there are indeed regulations regarding archaeological resources privately discovered, historical documents on private property occupy a much grayer area legally. This isn't like finding Native American artifacts, which have clear protection statutes. The professor paused before continuing. Gabriela, given this development, I think it's time to consider legal counsel. I have a colleague in the law school who specializes in cultural heritage and property rights. Would you like me to arrange a consultation? By morning, Gabriela had made arrangements to meet with Professor James Blackwood, a legal scholar specializing in cultural heritage law, at his university office later that day. The night had passed fitfully, her sleep interrupted by concerns about the document's security and the implications of the government's interest. Before departing for the university, she carefully moved the metal case containing the documents from its current hiding place to a more secure location, a small fireproof safe concealed beneath the floorboards in what had been her great-uncle's bedroom. The safe had been installed decades ago, according to family stories, to protect land deeds and what little valuables the family possessed during harder times. The drive to Albuquerque gave Gabriela time to collect her thoughts. The farm that had initially seemed like a burden, an obligation draining her savings and derailing her career, had unexpectedly connected her to two historical mysteries and apparent government interests that extended far beyond her quiet rural life. Professor Blackwood's office reflected his dual specialties in law and history, law books sharing space with works on cultural heritage preservation and indigenous rights. The professor himself, a man in his early 60s with silver-streaked hair and penetrating eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, greeted Gabriela with a warmth that belied the seriousness of their meeting. Dr. Hernandez has briefed me on the general situation, he began after introductions, though we've been deliberately circumspect in our communications. Before we discuss specifics, I should clarify that while I'm not acting as your attorney in a formal capacity, our conversation today falls under academic consultation privilege. With this assurance, Gabriela provided a detailed account of her discovery, the document's contents, Dr. Hernandez's preliminary assessment, and Major Williams' unexpected visit. Throughout her explanation, Blackwood listened intently, occasionally making notes but mostly absorbing the information with the focused attention of someone mapping complex terrain. You've found yourself in a fascinating intersection of property law, cultural heritage regulations, and national security interests, he observed when she had finished. The legal framework here is multi-layered and not always transparent. He leaned forward, hands clasped on his desk. First, regarding basic ownership rights. As the property owner who discovered these materials on land that has been in your family for generations, you have a strong initial claim. These aren't indigenous artifacts or human remains which would trigger specific protection statutes. What about the major suggestion that some historical materials fall under federal jurisdiction? Gabriela asked. That's where things get more complicated, Blackwood acknowledged. There are indeed provisions under various federal regulations that can be applied to historical materials deemed of national significance. However, these typically require specific designation processes and are subject to legal challenge. He pulled a legal text from his shelf, turning to a marked page. The government's interest in Spanish colonial documents has historical precedent. During World War II, certain categories of historical materials were temporarily classified under war powers, ostensibly for information about resources and terrain features that might have military significance. But that was decades ago, Gabriela pointed out. Indeed, but subsequent executive orders have maintained specialized handling protocols for certain historical materials, Blackwood explained. What makes your situation particularly interesting is that these documents were discovered on private property that has been continuously owned by your family since before many of these regulations were established. After discussing various legal precedents and considerations, Blackwood offered his assessment. Based on what you've described, I believe you have strong legal grounds to maintain possession while proper authentication and evaluation occur. However, given the government's demonstrated interest, proceeding with caution and proper documentation is essential. His recommendations were specific and practical. Maintain careful records of all communications regarding the documents. Proceed with authentication through reputable academic channels while retaining physical possession. And consider securing the documents in a neutral location, like a bank safe deposit box that would ensure proper preservation while strengthening her legal position regarding responsible stewardship. And regarding Major Williams? Gabriella asked. Polite acknowledgement without commitment is appropriate, Blackwood advised. You're under no obligation to grant access or surrender materials without proper legal process. If formal demands are made, that would be the point to engage specialized legal representation. As Gabriella prepared to leave, Blackwood added one final observation. What I find most intriguing about this situation isn't the legal framework, but the intensity of interest. Spanish colonial documents, while historically significant, rarely trigger such immediate government response. Whatever these materials contain clearly resonates with contemporary concerns beyond pure historical interest. The drive back to the farm gave Gabriella time to process this conversation and formulate next steps. The professor's insights had provided clear direction regarding her legal position while confirming her sense that the documents' significance extended beyond conventional historical value. As she turned onto the rural road leading to her property, Gabriella noticed something that sent a surge of alarm through her tire tracks. Turning off the main road onto a seldom-used access path that bordered her property. The tracks were fresh, the disturbed dust not yet settled by the afternoon breeze. Approaching her farmhouse with heightened caution, she parked behind the structure rather than in her usual spot, entering through the back door with senses alert for any sign of disturbance. The house appeared untouched, with no obvious evidence of entry, but the tension lingering in the air suggested recent presence. Checking the bedroom where she had hidden the documents, Gabriella found the floorboards undisturbed and the safe secure. Yet something felt wrong. The room had the subtle but unmistakable sense of having been searched. Items returned to their places with careful precision that nonetheless couldn't perfectly replicate their original positions. The realization that someone had entered her home, professionals skilled enough to leave minimal evidence, crystallized the seriousness of her situation. The historical documents that had seemed like an interesting discovery just days ago had apparently triggered surveillance and potentially illegal search of her property. With hands that refused to tremble despite her internal alarm, Gabriella checked the documents, confirming they remained secure in their hiding place. The invasion of her home demanded immediate response, yet she recognized that conventional authorities might be compromised given the apparent government interest in her discovery. Instead, she called Dr. Hernandez, keeping her explanation deliberately vague in case her communications were being monitored. The directness of his observation confirmed what Gabriella had suspected. The surveillance wasn't just targeting her movements, but maintaining continuous observation of the property itself. They've been watching since I found something while clearing the back section, she acknowledged, deciding that limited honesty with a trusted neighbor was preferable to obvious evasion. Miguel nodded slowly. My grandfather used to say that land holds secrets, some meant to be found, some better left buried. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. Those men aren't just random government officials, Gabriella. They've been asking questions in town about your family, about the history of your land. This new information heightened her concern. The surveillance wasn't passive observation, but active investigation, expanding beyond her property to the surrounding community. "There's something else you should know," Miguel continued, his voice lowering despite them being alone. "Your great-uncle Emilio wasn't just a simple farmer. During World War II, he worked with government researchers who came to study the geology of this region. There were rumors, nothing concrete, you understand, but rumors that they found something in the mountains southwest of here. Something important enough that the area was temporarily restricted, though no official explanation was ever given." This unexpected connection between her great-uncle and government research projects added another layer to the already complex situation. Had Emilio known more about what lay hidden on his property than his superstitious warnings had suggested? Was there a connection between World War II-era research and Spanish colonial discoveries centuries earlier? "After the war," Miguel continued, "your uncle became much more protective of his land, particularly that back section you've been clearing. He turned down good money from developers over the years, amounts that made no sense to refuse given his financial struggles." "Why are you telling me this now?" Gabriela asked, though she suspected the answer. "Because those government men asking questions aren't just interested in history," Miguel replied gravely. "They're from a division that doesn't officially exist, at least according to my nephew who works security contracts at White Sands. Whatever you found, Gabriela, it stirred up something that's been quiet for a long time." After Miguel departed, his warnings lingering in the quiet farmhouse, Gabriela returned to the document photographs with new perspective. The references to strange blue-white stones affecting nearby metals took on different significance in light of possible government research. Interest dating back to World War II, her scientific background offered possible interpretations: radioactive minerals perhaps, or unusual electromagnetic properties, but nothing that fully explained the intensity of current interest in centuries-old documents. Whatever connection existed between Spanish colonial discoveries and modern defense concerns remained elusive. The following morning brought unexpected developments. As Gabriela prepared to drive into town for supplies, she discovered that her truck wouldn't start, the battery completely dead despite being relatively new. The timing seemed suspiciously convenient, effectively stranding her on the isolated property. After attempting unsuccessfully to jumpstart the vehicle, she called the local mechanic, only to be told that they couldn't send someone out until the following day due to an unusually high volume of service calls. The subtle isolation tactics suggested escalation in whatever strategy the government representatives were pursuing. Her suspicions were confirmed when, less than an hour after her call to the mechanic, Major Williams' black SUV appeared on her driveway. This time, he was accompanied by a woman in civilian clothing whose bearing and attentiveness marked her as military despite the absence of uniform. "Ms. Mendoza," Williams greeted her with practiced cordiality. "I understand you're having vehicle troubles. We'd be happy to offer assistance, perhaps give you a ride into town for supplies while you wait for repairs." The transparent attempt to create obligation and opportunity for extended conversation was almost admirable in its directness. Gabriela declined with equal politeness, explaining that she had plenty of supplies and was expecting a visit from Dr. Hernandez later that day, a calculated mention of academic involvement to signal that she wasn't isolated despite the vehicle situation. "Of course," Williams nodded, seemingly unsurprised by her refusal. "In that case, perhaps we could discuss the historical materials you've discovered. My colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, specializes in Spanish colonial artifacts and would be particularly interested in your findings." The woman extended her hand with a professional smile. "Major Williams mentioned you've discovered what might be Coronado-era documents. My department has extensive resources for authentication and preservation that we'd be pleased to make available." "That's very kind," Gabriela replied. maintaining the polite fiction that this was a normal academic exchange rather than what increasingly felt like a pressure operation. However, the documents are currently undergoing authentication through university channels. Professor Hernandez has arranged specialized testing with experts in Spanish colonial materials. Dr. Reeves nodded, her smile unchanging though her eyes sharpened with interest. The university has excellent resources, of course. However, certain aspects of Spanish colonial documentation, particularly expedition records with cartographic elements, benefit from specialized analysis techniques developed for national security applications. The specific mention of cartographic elements maps when Gabriela had never disclosed this aspect of her discovery to Williams or any government representative confirmed her suspicions about surveillance and probably the search of her home. "I appreciate the government's interest," she responded carefully, "but I'll continue with the current authentication process for now. If specific national security concerns exist regarding these materials, I'm sure those can be addressed through appropriate legal channels." The reference to legal process was deliberate, signaling awareness of her rights and unwillingness to be pressured into voluntary cooperation. William's expression tightened almost imperceptibly before he recovered his professional demeanor. "Of course, we respect private property rights and academic processes," he assured her, though his tone suggested limited patience with these obstacles. "However, I should mention that certain categories of historical materials fall under specialized jurisdiction when they contain information relevant to defense planning or national resources." He produced an official-looking document from his briefcase. "This is a formal request for examination of the materials you've discovered, pursuant to Executive Order 13,526, regarding information with national security implications. While not a demand for surrender of the materials, it does establish official interest that could form the basis for more formal proceedings if necessary." The escalation to written documentation marked a significant shift in approach. Gabriela accepted the paper without comment, recognizing that proper response would require legal consultation rather than immediate reaction. "I'll have my attorney review this," she stated simply. "We'd appreciate a response within 48 hours, Williams replied, his tone making clear this was not merely a request but an expectation with consequences for non-compliance. After their departure, Gabriela immediately photographed the document and sent it to Professor Blackwood, following up with a phone call to explain the circumstances. His response was measured but concerned. "This invocation of Executive Order 13,526 is unusual for historical materials," he observed after reviewing the document. "That particular order primarily governs classification of government information, not privately discovered historical artifacts. They're attempting to create a jurisdictional bridge that I'm not convinced would withstand judicial scrutiny." "What should I do?" Gabriela asked, aware that the 48-hour deadline created artificial pressure. "Respond in writing through legal channels," Blackwood advised. "Acknowledge receipt of their request. Affirm your commitment to responsible stewardship of historically significant materials, and indicate that you're consulting with legal counsel regarding appropriate processes for addressing national security concerns while protecting legitimate private property and academic interests." He paused before adding, "And Gabriela? The intensity of their interest suggests there's something specific in these documents they're concerned about beyond general historical significance. If you haven't already, I would carefully review all material for anything that might have modern strategic implications." After the call, Gabriela attempted to start her truck again, discovering that the battery now functioned perfectly, confirming her suspicion that the failure had been deliberately engineered to facilitate William's visit. The crude manipulation tactic only strengthened her resolve to maintain control of her discovery until proper legal and academic processes could determine its appropriate disposition. That afternoon, Dr. Hernandez arrived as planned, accompanied by Dr. Vasquez, who had continued working on preliminary authentication based on the photographic evidence. The authentication experts' findings had progressed significantly since their meeting at the bank. "The documents are almost certainly authentic," she confirmed, spreading her analysis notes across Gabriella's kitchen table. Multiple authentication. Markers align with verified materials from the period: paper composition, ink formulation, linguistic patterns specific to mid-16th century Spanish expedition documentation. Dr. Vasquez pointed to specific elements in the photographs. Most convincingly, microscopic analysis of the ink shows chemical composition consistent with iron gall formulations used during the period, with aging patterns that cannot be artificially reproduced with modern methods. The parchment shows natural degradation patterns at the molecular level that align precisely with known samples from the era. This confirmation of authenticity elevated the significance of the documents from interesting historical curiosity to genuinely important historical discovery, potentially changing understanding of the Coronado expedition and early Spanish exploration of the Southwest. "I've also made progress translating additional sections," Dr. Vasquez continued, turning to her linguistic analysis. "The references to blue-white stones appear consistently throughout the journal, described as materials recovered from what the writer calls the chamber beneath the mesa at the location marked on the map." She pointed to a newly translated passage. "The stones change their nature when exposed to fire, transforming from solid to a substance that flows like water yet burns through metal. The native guides warn that those who handle the material directly suffer wasting sickness in subsequent months. Captain Mendoza has ordered samples sealed in lead containers before burial at the secondary site." The description suggested properties inconsistent with normal minerals known in the 16th century. Gabriella's scientific background offered potential modern explanations, possibly radioactive materials with unusual properties that would indeed cause radiation sickness in those handling them directly. "This particular description," Dr. Vasquez noted, "aligns with certain geological anomalies documented in this region, areas with unusual mineral compositions that have attracted scientific interest since at least the 1940s. The reference to the 1940s connected directly to Miguel's information about her great-uncle's involvement with government researchers during World War II. A pattern was emerging. Spanish explorers had potentially discovered unusual materials with strategic properties, materials that later attracted modern scientific interest during the development of nuclear technology. The government's intense interest is beginning to make more sense," Dr. Hernandez observed. "If these documents identify locations of rare mineral deposits with military applications, that would explain both historical classification decisions and current pressure tactics." Gabriella shared the formal request document Williams had delivered, along with Professor Blackwood's assessment and recommendations. The professors agreed with his approach, acknowledge receipt, affirm responsible stewardship, and indicate ongoing legal consultation rather than immediate compliance or refusal. "There's something else we should consider," Dr. Vasquez suggested after reviewing the government document. "The location marked on the map, the one with the cross and star symbol. Based on the journal descriptions, this appears to be a secondary site where samples were deliberately buried, not the original discovery location." She pointed to specific passages in the translation. "The primary chamber remains too dangerous for extended work. The strange metals embedded in the walls cause unexplained effects on our instruments and physical discomfort in workers exposed for more than a few hours. Captain Mendoza has ordered samples extracted and relocated to the secondary site marked on his private map, with the primary chamber entrance collapsed and disguised." This distinction between primary discovery site and secondary storage location added new complexity to the situation. If the documents revealed both locations, one potentially containing unusual natural materials in situ, and another containing deliberately collected samples. That would indeed represent information of potential strategic interest beyond historical significance. As evening approached, they drafted a careful response to Major Williams' formal request, following Professor Blackwood's guidance while incorporating the additional context provided by the translation progress. The response acknowledged receipt, affirmed Gabriella's commitment to responsible handling of historically significant materials, and indicated that she was consulting with legal counsel regarding appropriate processes for addressing potential national security implications while protecting legitimate private property and academic interests. "This buys us time," Dr. Hernandez explained as they finalized the document, "but we should anticipate escalation. The government's interest appears substantial enough that they're unlikely to simply accept procedural delays." The professor's prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. As they completed their work, the sound of approaching vehicles drew them to the window. 3 black SUVs were making their way up the long driveway to the farmhouse, a significant escalation from previous visits. "It seems our response timeline has been accelerated," Dr. Hernandez observed grimly. "Are you prepared for this confrontation, Gabriella?" Standing in the home that connected her to generations past, Gabriella felt a surprising calm settle over her. What had begun as a burden, a struggling farm draining her savings and derailing her career, had unexpectedly connected her to historical mysteries and apparent government interests that extended far beyond her quiet rural life. The documents secure in their bank vault represented not just historical artifacts, but a connection to truth, complex, sometimes uncomfortable truth that powerful institutions might prefer to control or suppress. As the government vehicles approached, Gabriella prepared to defend not just her legal rights as the discoverer, but the principle that history belonged to humanity, not to agencies with classified agendas. "I'm ready," she replied, straightening her shoulders. "Some truths are worth standing for, even when they come with complications." The approaching confrontation would test her determination, resources, and principles against institutional power with objectives still not fully understood. Yet in that moment, facing uncertainty with clarity of purpose, Gabriela Mendoza had never felt more connected to the land that had been entrusted to her, or more certain that she was exactly where she needed to be, facing precisely the challenge she was meant to address. What had begun beneath a crumbling stone wall on a neglected farm had developed into something far more significant than a mere historical discovery. It had become a test of who would control the narrative of the past and its implications for the present, powerful institutions with classified agendas, or individuals committed to truth regardless of its complications. As the vehicles drew closer, Gabriella prepared to ensure that the secrets hidden on her family's land for centuries would finally serve their proper purpose, illuminating history rather than remaining buried by it. The story of what happened next, where Gabriella's bravery led her, and how these discoveries ultimately changed our understanding of early Spanish expeditions, will continue tomorrow. Make sure you've subscribed so you don't miss what happens when Gabriella faces the Pentagon representatives at her door, and the shocking revelation that awaits when the location on the map is finally explored. Leave a comment telling us what you think the mysterious blue-white stones might actually be. The 3 black SUVs formed a semicircle in front of the farmhouse, their headlights illuminating the porch where Gabriella stood, flanked by Dr. Hernandez and Dr. Vasquez. Major Williams emerged from the center vehicle, accompanied by Dr. Reeves, and 2 men whose stiff postures and alert eyes marked them as security personnel despite their civilian clothing. "Ms. Mendoza," Williams called as he approached the porch, "I understand you've received our formal request. I was hoping we might discuss appropriate next steps." "I've prepared a written response," Gabriella replied, holding up the document they had drafted. "As you can see, I'm taking your request seriously and consulting with appropriate experts. Williams accepted the paper, but barely glanced at it before responding. While we appreciate your cooperation, circumstances have changed. We've received intelligence suggesting foreign interest in the materials you've discovered. This elevates the security concern significantly. Foreign interest? Dr. Hernandez questioned sharply. That seems improbable given the limited knowledge of Ms. Mendoza's discovery outside academic circles. Dr. Reeves stepped forward, her manner professional, but with underlying urgency. Professor, with respect, you may not appreciate the sophisticated intelligence-gathering capabilities of certain foreign entities. Historical discoveries with potential resource implications are monitored closely by several nations with interests in this region. The claims seem designed to create pressure through fear of unknown external threats, a tactic Gabriela recognized from environmental policy negotiations, where manufactured urgency was often used to bypass normal assessment processes. If there are specific threats, she responded evenly, those would be police or FBI matters. I'm not clear on how the Department of Defense has jurisdiction over historical documents discovered on private property. Williams' expression tightened at this direct challenge to his authority. Ms. Mendoza, these documents potentially contain location information for materials with national security implications. That places them squarely within DoD jurisdiction under multiple executive orders. Dating back to 1945, he produced another document, this one bearing official seals and signatures. This is a temporary security order authorizing examination of the materials in question. While it doesn't transfer ownership, it does require immediate access for national security assessment. Professor Blackwood had warned her about this possibility escalation to formal demands backed by executive authority. The question now was whether to challenge this authority immediately or find a middle path that protected her rights while acknowledging legitimate security concerns. The documents are secured in a bank vault, Gabriela stated, neither accepting nor rejecting the order directly. They're not physically present on this property. We're aware of that, Williams replied, confirming Gabriela's suspicions about surveillance levels. The order covers materials regardless of current location. We're prepared to accompany you to the bank tomorrow morning when they open. In the meantime, we'd like to discuss the contents based on your recollection and any copies or photographs you've retained. The phrasing was careful, a request for voluntary cooperation rather than a demand that might exceed the order's actual authority. Gabriela exchanged glances with Dr. Hernandez, whose subtle nod suggested a strategic concession might be appropriate. I have photographs for research purposes, Gabriela acknowledged. I'm willing to discuss the general contents, with the understanding that this cooperation doesn't waive any legal rights regarding ownership or control of the original documents. Williams visibly relaxed at this partial cooperation. That's reasonable. Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside. The next 2 hours unfolded as a careful dance of limited disclosure and subtle resistance. Seated around her kitchen table, Gabriela shared selected photographs of the documents while Dr. Vasquez provided translation of specific passages that had already been analyzed. They deliberately focused on the historical narrative aspects rather than specific location details, particularly avoiding precise information about the map. Throughout the discussion, Williams and Dr. Reeves demonstrated surprising knowledge of Spanish colonial exploration and 16th century document characteristics, occasionally asking technical questions that revealed specialized expertise beyond what might be expected from Defense Department officials. These descriptions of blue-white stones are particularly interesting, Dr. Reeves noted, pointing to one of the translated passages. The properties described affecting nearby metals, causing illness in those with direct exposure, transforming when heated, suggest a natural material with unusual properties. The Spanish wouldn't have had framework to understand radioactive minerals, but they could certainly observe and document their effects. The direct reference to radioactivity confirmed what Gabriela had already suspected: the government's interest centered on potential uranium deposits or similar strategic materials documented in the Spanish records. The journal mentions samples being relocated to a secondary site. Williams added, his tone deliberately casual, despite the clear focus on this critical detail. Does the map indicate this location specifically? The map contains several marked locations, Gabriela replied noncommittally. Without geological survey correlation, it's difficult to identify precise modern equivalents of 16th century landmarks. This careful evasion wasn't lost on Williams, whose expression suggested he recognized the deliberate vagueness, but chose not to challenge it directly. Instead, he shifted to what appeared to be a prepared compromise position. Ms. Mendoza, I understand your concern about maintaining control of your discovery. What we're proposing isn't confiscation, but a collaborative approach that respects both your rights as the discoverer and legitimate national security interests. He outlined a proposal: joint examination of the original documents by both government specialists and Gabriela's academic experts, conducted at a neutral facility with proper preservation capabilities. The government would provide resources for comprehensive authentication and preservation, while Gabriela would retain fundamental ownership rights, with specific provisions for academic publication of historical content after security review. This approach protects the documents themselves, acknowledges your discovery rights, and addresses security concerns in a balanced way, Williams concluded. It represents a good faith effort to find middle ground in a complex situation. The proposal was more reasonable than Gabriela had expected, suggesting either genuine interest in cooperation or recognition that heavy-handed tactics might prove counterproductive given the document's secure storage and her legal consultations. I appreciate the spirit of compromise, she responded carefully. I'll need to consult with my legal advisor before agreeing to specific arrangements, but your approach seems like a constructive starting point for discussion. This qualified acceptance appeared to satisfy Williams for the moment. After establishing communication protocols for the following day's bank visit, the government contingent departed, leaving Gabriela alone with the professors to assess the situation. They're being more reasonable than I expected, Dr. Hernandez observed once the vehicles had disappeared down the driveway. That suggests either sincere concern about legitimate security issues or recognition that you've positioned yourself too carefully for strong-arm tactics to succeed. Or they believe they'll get what they need through the examination process without having to force the issue, Dr. Vasquez added pragmatically. The location information in the map is clearly their primary interest. Gabriela nodded, having reached the same conclusion. The question is whether their interest is purely about potential uranium deposits or something more specific about the chamber beneath the mesa, described in the journal. This distinction seemed increasingly important. If the government's concern was general resource security, ensuring foreign entities couldn't use historical documents to locate strategic materials, that represented a legitimate national security interest. But the intensity and specificity of their focus suggested something more targeted: knowledge of particular discoveries that aligned with information in the Spanish documents. I think it's time we understood exactly what's on that map, Dr. Hernandez suggested. Not just the marked locations, but their correlation to modern geography and any known sites of scientific or military interest in the region. Dr. Vasquez, who had been methodically comparing the Spanish map with modern geographical resources on her tablet, looked up with sudden interest. I think I've identified the primary location, the one described as the chamber beneath the mesa. The landmark descriptions and distance measurements align with a formation approximately 50 miles southwest of here. She turned her tablet to show them, pointing to a distinctive mesa formation in the Carson National Forest. This area was temporarily restricted during the 1940s for what was officially described as geological survey work. Local rumors suggested uranium prospecting related to the Manhattan Project, but no official mining operations were ever established there. The connection to the 1940s government research that Miguel had mentioned in relation to Gabriela's great-uncle seemed increasingly significant. Whatever had been discovered at that location had apparently warranted classification for decades. With interest reactivated by the discovery of Spanish documents referencing the same site, what about the secondary location? Gabriela asked. The one where Captain Mendoza supposedly relocated samples? Dr. Vasquez returned to her comparative analysis. That's more challenging. The journal describes it as one day's ride to the east, beneath the Twin Peaks where the river bends north. There are several candidate locations that might match that description. As they continued analyzing the geographical correlations, a new question emerged in Gabriela's mind, one that connected personal family history with larger historical narratives. If Captain Mendoza from the Coronado expedition had indeed been an ancestor, and if the knowledge of these hidden materials had been passed down through generations, that might explain both her great-uncle's protective attitude toward the property and the government's specific interest in her family's land. The following morning brought renewed tension as Gabriela prepared to meet Williams at First National Bank. Following Professor Blackwood's advice, she had arranged for a legal representative to accompany her, a young attorney named Michael Torres from Blackwood's firm who specialized in cultural heritage disputes. Our position is cooperative but firm, Torres explained as they drove toward town. We acknowledge legitimate security review interests while maintaining fundamental ownership rights and academic access. The key is establishing clear protocols for the examination process that protect your interests. At the bank, Williams and Dr. Reeves were already waiting, accompanied by a third individual introduced as Dr. Lawrence Chun, a document authentication specialist with government clearance. The examination would take place in the same secure room where Dr. Vasquez had conducted her preliminary authentication. Before retrieving the documents from the vault, Torres presented Williams with a memorandum of understanding he had prepared overnight. The document outlined specific conditions for the examination. Gabriela or her representative would maintain physical custody throughout. No materials would leave the secure room. Photography would be permitted for analytical purposes, but with explicit ownership attribution. And any findings with legitimate national security implications would be addressed through appropriate legal channels with minimum impact on historical academic value. Williams reviewed the document with evident surprise at its professional thoroughness. After brief consultation with Dr. Reeves, he signed without substantive objection, another indication that the government's approach had shifted from intimidation to negotiated cooperation. The examination process itself was methodical and professional. Dr. Chun's expertise in document authentication was evident as he employed specialized equipment to analyze paper composition, ink characteristics, and aging patterns without damaging the fragile materials. His findings aligned with Dr. Vasquez's preliminary assessment. The documents were almost certainly authentic, 16th century Spanish colonial materials. Throughout the process, Williams and Dr. Reeves focused particular attention on the map, carefully documenting the marked locations and surrounding geographical features. Their interest in the secondary site, the one where samples had allegedly been relocated, seemed especially acute, suggesting this location might be unknown to them despite their apparent familiarity with the primary chamber beneath the mesa. These directional indicators are particularly interesting, Dr. Reeves noted, pointing to symbols along what appeared to be a route marking. They don't align with standard Spanish cartographic practices from the period. They appear almost intentionally obscured, designed to be understood only by those with specific knowledge. This observation aligned with the journal's indication that Captain Mendoza had created private maps with deliberately limited distribution documents intended to secure discovered resources rather than report them to Crown authorities. As the examination continued, Gabriella observed the government representatives with careful attention, noting which elements triggered particular interest or urgent consultation among themselves. Their focus revealed priorities and potential knowledge gaps that might prove strategically valuable in future negotiations. After nearly 4 hours of detailed examination, Williams appeared to have gathered the information he considered most critical. Ms. Mendoza, we appreciate your cooperation. These materials clearly have significant historical value beyond any security considerations. Our preliminary assessment suggests limited areas of potential security concern, primarily related to specific location information rather than historical narrative content. This was a notable concession acknowledging the documents' historical significance and narrowing security concerns to geographical information, rather than claiming broader classification necessity. It suggested a path forward that might balance national security interests with academic access and historical preservation. What happens next? Gabriella asked directly. We'll prepare a formal assessment identifying specific content with potential security implications, Williams explained. This will form the basis for a proposed handling protocol that addresses legitimate security concerns, while respecting ownership rights and historical value. I anticipate having this assessment completed within approximately 1 week. The reasonableness of this approach was simultaneously reassuring and suspicious. After initial surveillance, apparent home searches, and escalating pressure tactics, this pivot to professional collaboration seemed incongruous, unless motivated by strategic calculation rather than genuine respect for her rights. After securing the documents back in the vault and departing the bank, Torres offered his assessment of the situation. They got what they really wanted: confirmation of the map locations and route markings. The cooperative approach likely reflects recognition that challenging your ownership rights would be legally complex and potentially public, while voluntary cooperation gives them the essential information more efficiently. This pragmatic analysis aligned with Gabriella's own suspicions. So what do we do now? Wait for their assessment and proposed protocols? Partially, Torres agreed. But I'd also recommend continuing independent research on both the historical significance and any potential modern implications of the locations identified in the documents. Knowledge parity will be essential for evaluating whether their security concerns are legitimate or overreaching. Returning to the farm, Gabriella found Dr. Hernandez and Dr. Vasquez still deeply engaged in correlation analysis between the Spanish map and modern geographical resources. Their progress had been substantial, identifying several potential candidates for the secondary site based on landmark descriptions and distance measurements from the journal. The most promising location appears to be here, Dr. Vasquez indicated on her tablet, highlighting a formation approximately 30 miles east of the primary site. A distinctive double peak formation with a river that changes course nearby. The area is currently part of private ranchland, though historical records show it was previously government property until being sold in the 1970s. This historical ownership pattern raised interesting questions. If the government had identified this location during the 1940s research period Miguel had mentioned, why would they subsequently sell the property? Had they exhausted whatever resources were present, determined there was nothing of value, or simply lost track of its significance over time? As these questions lingered, Gabriella's phone rang. Miguel Sandoval calling with unexpected urgency. Gabriella, there are people at my property asking about land surveys from the 1940s. Men in suits who say they're from the Geological Survey Office, but don't quite feel right. They're particularly interested in the section that borders your eastern boundary. This new development confirmed that the government's interest extended beyond the documents themselves to potential physical locations they identified. The eastern boundary of Gabriella's property aligned with the general direction indicated for the secondary site in the Spanish documents, the location where Captain Mendoza had allegedly relocated samples from the primary chamber. After assuring Miguel she would explain everything soon, Gabriella shared this development with the professors. The implications were significant if the government was investigating neighboring properties based on the map information. They might have already identified potential locations for the secondary site and were moving to secure access. This changes our timeline, Dr. Hernandez observed. If they're already pursuing physical investigation, waiting for their formal assessment could mean losing the opportunity to understand what's actually at these locations before government security protocols restrict access. The observation crystallized something Gabriella had been considering since first understanding the documents. Significance that knowing what was actually at these locations would fundamentally change the power dynamics and negotiations with government representatives. Information asymmetry currently favored Williams and his team, who likely had historical knowledge about the primary site from the 1940s, research but might be uncertain about the secondary location. I think we need to visit at least one of these sites, Gabriella suggested, before access potentially becomes restricted. Not to remove anything or disturb archaeological context, but to document and understand what's actually there. Dr. Vasquez nodded in agreement. From a historical archaeology perspective, that's entirely appropriate. These locations represent potentially significant historical sites related to both indigenous history and early Spanish exploration. Preliminary documentation would be standard academic practice, particularly when sites might be at risk. The decision crystallized with surprising clarity. They would make an expedition to the most promising candidate for the secondary site the following day. Focusing on documentation rather than disturbance, Dr. Vasquez would bring appropriate archaeological field equipment for preliminary site assessment, while Dr. Hernandez would focus on historical contextualization. As they prepared equipment and supplies for the expedition, Gabriella found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed in just over a week. The struggling farm that had seemed like a burden draining her savings and derailing her environmental science career had unexpectedly connected her to historical mysteries with apparent national security implications. The land itself, which she had viewed primarily as an obligation to family legacy, now represented a potential key to understanding both her personal ancestry and broader historical narratives about early Spanish exploration. That evening, as sunset painted the distant mesas with golden light, Gabriella called Elena her best friend who had so strongly advised selling the property when she first inherited it. The conversation represented both an update for a trusted friend and a way to establish safety protocols for the coming expedition. "So let me get this straight," Elena summarized after Gabriella had outlined recent events. "You found Spanish treasure maps hidden in a wall. The Pentagon is after them. And now you're planning to go hunt for centuries-old radioactive materials, hidden by your possible ancestor before government agents can secure the location." Put so directly, the situation did sound rather extraordinary. "That's approximately correct," Gabriella acknowledged with a small laugh. "Though I'd characterize it as preliminary archaeological documentation rather than treasure hunting. And you want me to be your safety contact. If you don't check in by tomorrow evening, I should contact Professor Blackwood and report your last known location?" "Exactly. It's just a precaution, but given the government interest and the remote location, having someone know our plans seems prudent." Elena was silent for a moment before responding. "You know, when I told you to sell that decrepit farm, this scenario wasn't exactly what I was worried about." Her tone shifted from humor to seriousness. "Be careful, Gabby. Whatever is out there has apparently been important enough for people to hide, seek, and protect for centuries. That kind of significance doesn't come without risks. The warning was valid, yet Gabriella felt a surprising sense of clarity about the path ahead. The discovery hadn't just connected her to historical mysteries but to her own sense of purpose and place. The struggling farm that had seemed like a financial millstone now represented connection to land, history, and truth that transcended mere economic calculation. "I'll be careful," she promised. "But I need to understand what's actually out there before decisions are made about who controls access to it. Some truths are worth pursuing, even when they come with complications." After ending the call, Gabriella joined the professors on the porch, where they were finalizing plans for the next day's expedition. The evening air carried the distinctive scent of desert sage and pinyon pine, connecting present moment to centuries of human experience on this land. Whatever discoveries awaited at the secondary site, they represented threads in a complex tapestry of history that connected indigenous knowledge, Spanish exploration, government research, and Gabriella's own family legacy. As darkness settled over the farm, distant headlights appeared briefly on the access road before disappearing, a reminder that others were also pursuing these historical secrets with their own motivations and agendas. Tomorrow's expedition wasn't just about archaeological documentation, but about determining who would control the narrative of what Captain Mendoza had discovered nearly 5 centuries ago. The morning brought clear skies and a sense of purpose as Gabriella, Dr. Hernandez, and Dr. Vasquez loaded equipment into Dr. Hernandez's sturdy SUV. They had decided against using Gabriella's truck, partly because the professor's vehicle was better suited to rough terrain, but also because it was less likely to be recognized if government representatives were monitoring local roads. Their destination lay approximately 30 miles east of location where distinctive Twin Peaks overlooked a river bend that aligned with descriptions from the Spanish documents. The site was currently part of private ranchland, but Dr. Hernandez had secured permission for academic access through university channels, describing it as a preliminary archaeological survey of potential Spanish colonial significance. As they departed, Gabriella noticed 2 unfamiliar vehicles parked along the access road, continuing surveillance that confirmed the importance of their discreet approach to today's expedition. By taking Dr. Hernandez's vehicle and departing via the service road that connected to Miguel's property rather than the main driveway, they hoped to avoid immediate detection of their destination and purpose. The journey took them through increasingly rugged terrain-high desert, transitioning to pinyon juniper woodland as they climbed in elevation. Dr. Vasquez navigated using both modern GPS systems and careful correlation with landmark descriptions from the Spanish documents, occasionally identifying geographical features that aligned with the centuries-old observations. The Spanish descriptions of this landscape are remarkably accurate, she noted as they passed a distinctive rock formation mentioned in the journal. Despite centuries of erosion and climate change, the major landmarks remain recognizable. Captain Mendoza was clearly a skilled observer and cartographer. This connection across centuries, the ability to follow directions recorded by Spanish explorers in 1541, created a tangible link between past and present that made the historical narrative feel immediate rather than distant. These weren't just academic artifacts but practical guides, created by individuals navigating the same physical landscape for specific purposes that remained relevant nearly 5 centuries later. After approximately 2 hours of careful progress along increasingly primitive roads, they reached the boundary of the ranch property where they had secured access permission. From there, they continued on foot, carrying essential documentation equipment and following a dry creek bed that the Spanish documents described as the approach route to the secondary site. The Twin Peaks rose before them, distinctive formations that matched the description from Captain Mendoza's journal. Between them, a narrow canyon opened into what appeared to be a small hidden valley, a pufa, location that would provide both concealment and access to water when the seasonal creek was flowing. "This matches the description perfectly," Dr. Vasquez confirmed, consulting her notes. "Proceed between the twin guardians to where the earth opens and water flows in the wet season. Look for the standing stone marked with the cross." The standing stone proved more challenging to locate. Centuries of erosion, vegetation growth, and possible deliberate concealment had altered the landscape from its 16th century appearance. After methodical searching of the valley floor, Dr. Hernandez called them to a weathered rock formation partially concealed by juniper growth. "I think this is it," she indicated, carefully clearing away branches to reveal what appeared to be faint markings on the stone surface. Years of environmental exposure had nearly obliterated the carvings, but the distinctive shape of a cross remained barely visible. Not a Christian cross, but the same star-cross symbol that had marked the location on the Spanish map. Following the journal's description, they examined the area immediately surrounding the marked stone, looking for signs of deliberate burial or concealment. Dr. Vasquez employed ground-penetrating radar equipment from her archaeological kit, methodically scanning the surrounding area for subsurface anomalies. "There's something here," she announced after several passes with the equipment. Approximately 3 feet down, a distinctly non-natural formation, possibly a chamber or container, approximately 4 feet in length. The discovery confirmed they had indeed located the secondary site described in the Spanish documents, the location where Captain Mendoza had allegedly relocated samples from the primary chamber. The question now was how to proceed. Archaeological ethics and legal considerations suggested documenting but not disturbing the site. Yet understanding what was actually contained might be critical for evaluating government security claims. As they debated appropriate next steps, a sound in the distance caught their attention. The distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors approaching from the direction they had come. The aircraft appeared moments later, circling the valley before hovering directly overhead, a black military-style helicopter without visible identification markings. "It seems our expedition hasn't gone unnoticed," Dr. Hernandez observed grimly. "They must have been monitoring potential sites based on the map information." The helicopter's presence created immediate pressure. Continuing undetected documentation was now impossible. Yet abandoning the site without understanding what lay beneath the marked stone would mean losing critical information for evaluating the government's security claims. In that moment of decision, with the helicopter circling overhead and the buried secrets of centuries within reach, Gabriela Mendoza faced perhaps the most significant choice since discovering the documents in her great-uncle's stone wall: whether to proceed with excavation despite potential legal complications, or withdraw with only preliminary documentation of a site that might soon become inaccessible under government security protocols. The helicopter's shadow passed over them again as Gabriela weighed not just legal considerations but moral ones: the responsibility to historical truth, the obligations of proper archaeological practice, and the practical reality that whatever lay buried here had remained hidden for centuries and might well disappear into classified obscurity if she didn't act now. The helicopter circled lower, its downdraft stirring dust across the valley floor as Gabriela made her decision. Abandoning the site now would mean surrendering the truth to those who might conceal it for reasons beyond historical accuracy or public benefit. "We document everything," she called to the professors over the helicopter noise. "But we don't disturb the site itself. That's the ethical middle ground." Dr. Vasquez nodded in agreement, already activating advanced imaging equipment from her archaeological kit. "Full surface and subsurface documentation. We create a complete digital record before anyone can restrict access." Working with practiced efficiency, despite the helicopter's intimidating presence, they deployed the ground-penetrating radar in a systematic grid pattern across the area surrounding the marked stone. Dr. Hernandez photographed the site from multiple angles with specialized archaeological documentation equipment, while Gabriella used her environmental science training to record soil samples and geological context. The helicopter made another pass, lower this time, clearly attempting to intimidate rather than merely observe. Dust billowed around them, but they continued their documentation with determined focus, creating a comprehensive record that would exist regardless of what happened next. "We've got company," Dr. Hernandez called, pointing toward the canyon entrance where two black SUVs had appeared, bouncing over the rough terrain with urgent purpose. Gabriella recognized one as Major Williams' vehicle. "5 more minutes, Doctor," Vasquez responded, still working the ground-penetrating radar in precise patterns. "The subsurface imaging is almost complete." As the vehicles approached, Dr. Hernandez transferred all their documentation data to multiple backup devices, handing one to Gabriella. "Whatever happens, the record exists now. They can control the physical site, but not the knowledge of what's here." The SUVs skidded to a halt 50 yards away, and Major Williams emerged along with several men in tactical gear despite their civilian clothing. Their purposeful approach carried unmistakable authority, but notably lacked drawn weapons or overt threats, suggesting they recognized the limits of their actual jurisdiction on private land, where access permission had been legally obtained. "Miss Mendoza," Williams called as he approached, his expression a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. "I thought we had an understanding about cooperation regarding these locations. We're conducting legitimate archaeological documentation of a potential Spanish colonial site," Gabriella responded calmly, standing her ground. "As environmental scientists and historians with proper access permission from the landowner." Williams glanced at the equipment they deployed, clearly recognizing the non-invasive nature of their approach. "You haven't attempted excavation?" "Of course not," Dr. Vasquez interjected professionally. "Preliminary documentation is standard archaeological procedure. Excavation would require permits and extensive preparation. We're simply creating a record of the site's existence and apparent characteristics." This adherence to proper archaeological protocols, despite the pressure of the moment, seemed to place Williams in a difficult position. Their actions were technically appropriate and legally conducted with landowner permission, yet clearly contrary to his desire to control access to information about the site. "This location may have security implications beyond historical significance," he stated, shifting to his core concern. "The materials potentially buried here could present environmental hazards requiring specialized handling." "If you're referring to radioactive materials, as your presence suggests," Gabriella responded, "then proper documentation becomes even more important from an environmental safety perspective. That falls directly within my professional expertise." This framing positioning their documentation as responsible environmental assessment rather than treasure hunting visibly shifted the dynamic. Williams was clearly prepared to assert security jurisdiction over historical artifacts, but found himself less equipped to challenge legitimate environmental safety documentation by qualified scientists. Dr. Vasquez seized this momentary advantage. "Major, our ground-penetrating radar has identified what appears to be a manufactured container approximately 3 feet below the surface. The dimensions and composition suggest a deliberately constructed chamber rather than natural formation. This aligns with Spanish colonial documentation describing secure storage of materials with unusual properties." She displayed the radar imaging on her tablet, revealing a distinct rectangular formation beneath the marked stone. The responsible approach would be coordinated assessment, involving both security interests and independent scientific expertise. The materials have remained stable for nearly 5 centuries, suggesting there's no immediate hazard requiring emergency intervention. Williams studied the radar images with evident interest, the discovery apparently confirming information he had been seeking. After conferring briefly with one of his team members, He turned back to Gabriella with what appeared to be a genuine attempt at compromise. "What I'm about to propose goes beyond standard protocols, but this situation warrants creative solutions." He began. "We establish a joint assessment team, your archaeological and environmental expertise, combined with our specialized handling capabilities. The site remains under shared observation while we determine appropriate next steps through proper legal channels." The offer represented a significant shift from his initial approach, acknowledging their legitimate role rather than attempting to exclude them entirely. It suggested recognition that cooperation might ultimately prove more effective than confrontation, particularly given the public documentation they had already secured. Any samples recovered would be subject to proper scientific analysis with results shared between legitimate stakeholders, Gabriella countered, establishing terms rather than simply accepting his proposal. Environmental impact assessment would include independent verification, not just classified government review. Williams considered this for a moment before nodding. "Those terms are acceptable, provided certain national security protocols are observed for specific findings. We can establish appropriate clearance for essential personnel." This negotiated framework balancing security concerns with scientific integrity and historical accuracy represented something rare in such confrontations, a genuine recognition of shared interests despite differing priorities. The historical truth contained at this site wouldn't disappear into classified obscurity, nor would legitimate security concerns be dismissed in pursuit of academic publication. Over the next several hours, an extraordinary collaboration unfolded. As government specialists arrived with specialized equipment for radiation detection and secure sample collection. Working alongside the academic team, they established a systematic approach to site assessment that maintained both scientific protocols and security considerations. The ground-penetrating radar had identified a rectangular chamber approximately 3 feet below the surface. Rather than immediate excavation, they employed minimally invasive assessment techniques, small core samples, and fiber optic imaging inserted through narrow access points that wouldn't compromise the site's archaeological integrity. What they discovered confirmed the extraordinary nature of what Captain Mendoza had hidden centuries earlier. The chamber contained what appeared to be a lead-lined box approximately 3 feet long and 18 inches wide. Its construction showing remarkable preservation despite centuries underground. The Spanish colonial craftsmanship was evident even through the limited fiber optic viewing, with distinctive metalwork consistent with 16th century techniques. More significantly, radiation detection equipment confirmed the presence of radioactive material within the container low level but distinctly present, explaining both the historical descriptions of illness in those handling the samples directly and the government's contemporary security concerns. The lead lining was remarkably advanced thinking for the 16th century, observed Dr. Chun, who had joined the site team as the government's authentication specialist. They clearly recognized that something about these materials caused illness, and developed containment based on observation rather than scientific understanding. Indigenous knowledge likely played a significant role, Dr. Vasquez suggested. The journal mentions native guides warning about handling the materials directly. They had potentially observed the effects over generations and developed avoidance practices. As the assessment continued, Gabriella found herself in conversation with Dr. Reeves, whose expertise in historical materials now seemed more genuine than her initial government representative role had suggested. "What exactly are these materials?" Gabriella asked directly. The Spanish description suggests properties inconsistent with conventional minerals known in the 16th century. Dr. Reeves hesitated before responding, apparently weighing security protocols against the reality that Gabriella was now directly involved in the assessment. Based on historical testing from similar sites, they appear to be naturally occurring uranium deposits with unusually high concentration and purity. What makes them particularly significant is evidence of ancient mining activity that predates Spanish arrival, suggesting indigenous knowledge of these materials and their properties, centuries before European scientific understanding. This revelation added another layer to the historical significance. The Spanish hadn't merely discovered unusual minerals, but had encountered indigenous civilizations with their own established knowledge about these materials and their effects. The journal mentions the chamber beneath the mesa as the primary site, Gabriela noted. What's there? That's classified information, Williams interjected. Having overheard the conversation, Dr. Reeves gave him a measured look before turning back to Gabriela. What I can share is that the primary site contains geological formations with unusual properties that have scientific significance beyond historical interest. The 1940s research program your great-uncle participated in was focused on understanding these properties in the context of emerging nuclear science. This partial disclosure confirmed the connection between Spanish colonial discoveries, her great-uncle's involvement with government researchers, and contemporary security interests, a continuity of knowledge about these unusual materials, spanning centuries of human interaction with this landscape. As evening approached, they established a secure perimeter around the site with plans for formal excavation the following day using proper archaeological protocols combined with specialized handling procedures for potentially hazardous materials. The joint team would include both government specialists and academic experts, maintaining the balanced approach negotiated earlier. Williams approached Gabriela as the day's work concluded, his manner more collegial than in previous interactions. You've handled this situation remarkably well, Ms. Mendoza. Many people would have either attempted excavation without proper precautions or surrendered control entirely when confronted with government interest. I'm an environmental scientist, she reminded him. My training is about balancing human knowledge needs with protection of both people and resources. This situation isn't fundamentally different, just with higher stakes and historical complexity. He nodded thoughtfully. There's something else you should know, something that explains our particular interest in your discovery beyond general security protocols. After ensuring they wouldn't be overheard, Williams continued. The documents you found aren't the first Spanish colonial materials referring to these unusual deposits. Similar records emerged during the 1940s, leading to the research program your great-uncle participated in. What makes your discovery uniquely significant is the map showing the secondary location, the site we're currently assessing. You knew about the primary site, but not this one, Gabriela surmised. The government's intense interest finally making complete sense. Correct. The primary site has been under secure management since the 1940s, but historical records suggested samples had been relocated to a secondary location that remained unidentified despite extensive search efforts. Your discovery effectively completed a historical puzzle we've been working on for decades. This acknowledgement of her discovery's significance represented more than just professional courtesy. It positioned her not as a security problem to be managed, but as a key contributor to understanding that spanned generations. As they prepared to depart for the day, with security personnel remaining to monitor the site overnight, Dr. Hernandez pulled Gabriela aside for a private conversation. Whatever happens with the physical materials, you've ensured the historical record won't disappear into classified obscurity. The documentation we've created exists independently of whatever they might restrict. This assurance affirmed the value of their morning's work before the government team arrived, creating a comprehensive record that would exist regardless of subsequent access limitations or security classifications. That evening, as they returned to the farmhouse to prepare for the following day's formal excavation, Gabriela found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had unfolded since discovering the hidden documents in her great-uncle's stone wall. What had begun as financial burden and career disruption had transformed into something far more meaningful: connection to historical truth that spanned centuries and linked her personal family legacy to broader narratives about human interaction with this landscape. The farm itself, which had initially seemed like an obligation draining her savings and derailing her environmental science career, now represented something profoundly different, a place where past and present converged, where generations of her family had maintained connection to land that held secrets spanning centuries of human experience. As sunset painted the distant mesas with golden light, Gabriella sat on the farmhouse porch with a newfound sense of purpose and belonging. The financial challenges hadn't disappeared, the mortgage still needed payment, the equipment still needed repair, the field still required cultivation. But these practical concerns now existed within a larger context of meaning and connection that transformed their significance from burden to heritage. The following morning brought clear skies and focused purpose as the joint team assembled at the site for formal excavation. With proper archaeological protocols combined with specialized handling procedures, they carefully removed layers of soil to expose the lead-lined container Captain Mendoza had buried nearly 5 centuries earlier. The box itself represented a remarkable artifact, Spanish colonial craftsmanship, preserved through centuries by careful construction and deliberate placement. The lead lining, apparently added based on observations about the material's effects, demonstrated sophisticated problem-solving despite limited scientific understanding. Inside, they discovered what the Spanish documents had described as blue-white stones, mineral samples with distinctive coloration and unusual weight for their size. Government specialists immediately secured these in specialized containers, while taking readings that confirmed their radioactive nature. Preliminary assessment suggests high-grade uranium ore, Dr. Reeves explained as the samples were prepared for transport to specialized facilities. What makes them historically significant beyond their material properties is the evidence of pre-Columbian mining and utilization. The indigenous populations apparently recognized these materials, unusual properties centuries before European scientific frameworks could explain them. This understanding of indigenous knowledge, spanning generations before European arrival, added crucial historical context that transcended mere resource identification. Whatever scientific or strategic significance these materials held in modern context, they represented human observation and knowledge transmission across cultures and centuries. As the excavation concluded and the materials were secured for specialized analysis, Major Williams approached Gabriella with what appeared to be a formal document. This outlines the terms we've negotiated: joint assessment protocols, shared access to non-classified findings, and recognition of your discovery rights while addressing legitimate security considerations. The document represented a balanced approach that neither dismissed security concerns nor sacrificed historical truth to classification obscurity. It acknowledged Gabriella's role not just in discovering the Spanish documents, but in ensuring their historical significance wouldn't be lost within security protocols. There's something else, Williams added, producing a second document. The university has expressed interest in acquiring your discovery for their special collections, with appropriate compensation that recognizes its historical significance. The government would support this arrangement while maintaining necessary security protocols for specific content. The proposal outlined substantial financial compensation that would not only address the farm's mortgage challenges but provide funding for continued operation and improvement. It represented recognition of both the discovery's significance and Gabriella's responsible handling of materials with complex historical and security implications. This isn't about buying silence, Williams clarified, apparently recognizing her hesitation. The historical narrative would be preserved with appropriate academic access. Security restrictions would apply only to specific location information, with potential misuse concerns, not to the broader historical content. The arrangement offered resolution to the practical challenges that had initially seemed overwhelming when she inherited the struggling farm. More importantly, it validated the historical significance of her discovery while establishing frameworks for responsible management of both security concerns and academic access. 1 week later, Gabriela stood in the university's special collections department where her discovery now held a place of honor in a specialized display case. The Spanish documents, carefully preserved and protected, were being meticulously studied by a team of historians specializing in colonial exploration, with Dr. Hernandez leading research into their implications for understanding early European contact with indigenous populations. The financial compensation had indeed resolved the immediate challenges facing the farm. The mortgage was now paid in full, essential equipment repaired or replaced, and operations stabilized with sufficient reserves for sustainable management. But Gabriela had made an additional decision that reflected her transformed relationship with the property and its significance. Rather than returning to her environmental consulting position in Albuquerque, she had established a research partnership between the university and her farm, creating an environmental field station focused on sustainable agriculture practices and historical land use patterns in the region. The arrangement allowed her to combine her scientific expertise with newfound appreciation for the land's historical significance, creating educational opportunities that connected present environmental challenges with centuries of human interaction. With this landscape, Miguel Sandoval had become an enthusiastic partner in this venture, contributing his generational knowledge of traditional farming practices that had sustained families in this region through centuries of climate cycles and changing conditions. Together, they were developing educational programs that integrated indigenous knowledge, Spanish colonial history, and modern sustainable agriculture techniques, creating models for resilience in an increasingly unpredictable climate future. The buried materials from the secondary site remained under specialized management, with scientific analysis continuing under joint academic and government oversight. The findings were gradually revealing not just geological characteristics, but historical patterns of human knowledge about these unusual materials spanning indigenous observation, Spanish colonial documentation, and modern scientific understanding. As for the primary site, the mysterious chamber beneath the mesa, described in Captain Mendoza's journal, it remained classified, though Gabriela now understood its basic significance through her security clearance as a consulting environmental scientist for the ongoing research program. The site contained geological formations with properties that continued to generate scientific interest beyond historical significance, connecting centuries of human observation to emerging understanding of nuclear physics and material sciences. One afternoon, as Gabriela worked with university students in a newly established demonstration field on the farm, she noticed Elena's car approaching along the driveway. Her friend had finally accepted an invitation to visit the property she had once so strongly advised selling to see firsthand the transformation from struggling inheritance to thriving research center. "I have to admit, this isn't what I pictured when you said you were keeping the farm," Elena acknowledged as Gabriela showed her the renovated buildings now serving as classroom and laboratory space. "It's like you found your purpose along with those old documents." The observation captured something essential about Gabriela's journey since discovering the hidden chamber in her great-uncle's stone wall. What had begun as financial burden and career disruption had revealed itself as connection to something larger. Of course, his financial burden and career disruption had revealed itself as connection to something larger. Continuity of human experience on this land spanning centuries of observation, knowledge, and relationship with the natural world. The discovery changed everything, Gabriela agreed, looking out across fields that now represented not just agricultural production, but living laboratory for sustainable practices grounded in generations of human experience. But not in the way treasure stories usually end. It wasn't about financial value, though that helped. It was about finding meaningful connection to this land, to history, to purpose. As sunset painted the distant mesas with golden light, the same light that had illuminated this landscape for Captain Mendoza nearly 5 centuries earlier, for indigenous observers countless generations before that, and for her great-uncle. During his own stewardship of this land, Gabriela felt profound gratitude for the seemingly unfortunate circumstances that had led her here. The struggling farm that had seemed like financial suicide had revealed itself as inheritance beyond monetary measure, connection to land that held secrets spanning centuries, to knowledge that transcended cultural boundaries, and a purpose that integrated past and present in service to future understanding. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't what's buried in the ground, she told Elena as they watched the golden light transform the landscape, but what we discover about ourselves when we commit to something larger than immediate self-interest. The farm that had once seemed like burden had become laboratory for this understanding, that value transcends financial calculation, that knowledge spans generations when properly stewarded, and that connection to land carries responsibilities that reward commitment with meaning beyond mere ownership. What historians now call the Mendoza discovery fundamentally altered our understanding of indigenous knowledge transfer, Spanish colonial exploration, and the complex intersection of historical documentation with modern security concerns. Academic delegations now regularly visit the research center established on Gabriela's farm. Specialized conferences explore the implications of the Spanish documents for historical narratives about early European contact, and educational programs connect new generations to sustainable practices grounded in centuries of human experience on this land. But perhaps the most significant transformation occurred not in historical textbooks or academic understanding, but in one woman's relationship with inherited land that initially seemed like financial burden rather than meaningful legacy. The discovery beneath the stone wall had revealed connections spanning centuries, reminding us that when we commit to understanding the places we inhabit, we often discover purposes and meanings that transform apparent burdens into profound inheritance. The treasure Gabriela Mendoza ultimately found wasn't the radioactive minerals that had attracted Spanish explorers, government researchers, and security specialists across centuries. It was purpose rooted in place, connection to land that transcended ownership to become stewardship, knowledge that spanned generations, and meaning that transformed inheritance from financial obligation to life-defining purpose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.